So take it
Okay, so good morning, everyone. Welcome back for another session. This one will be better than all the others that you've attended of mine because co-teaching with me is Dr. Bordan, Dr. Terry Bordan. We did a class on criminal psychology not that long ago, and we also did one on what was then President Trump and the works that had been done by an assortment of psychologists who had suggested that he might fit the characterization of a psychopath. And so we presented that class and had a good time with it. Anyway, Dr. Bordan is a licensed professional counselor and a former professor and chair of the graduate department of counseling and development at Long Island University. And if you have seen the, I think it was a Netflix program called The Chair, that was really modeled on a true story of Dr. Bordan. She's also the former director of counseling at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, past editor of the Journal for Professional Counselor, and has taught in the Tactical Officers Education Program at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. She's presented at national workshops, seminars, and featured in the New York Times and Newsday. She's appeared on multiple television shows and hosted her own radio show, Dr. Bordan and Company, and she has extensive clinical experience as a mental health practitioner. I was a patient of hers. No, I wasn't. And so anyway, today we're going to take on the topic of psychology and propaganda. As many of you know, my background was in security and security analysis. Part of my studies were in criminal psychology, not in the sense of diagnosis, but in understanding the characteristics and traits of assorted mental health issues that might help to explain criminality or someone who is under investigation, but not for the purpose of conducting a diagnostic. That would be more for a clinical psychologist. Okay, so the landscape of what we planned for this class is that today we'll have an introduction, some of where the roots of the concepts of propaganda were born. We're going to talk in class 2 more about propaganda. In class 3, we're going to highlight the things within a person or group of people that are exploited by propagandists. Bias, we have 2 classes that are going to look at various types of bias. Mind you, we break them down into individual categories. They often spill over into each other, but for the purpose of discussion, we want to dissect them as individual things, even though a person may have multiple biases. Then in class 5, we're going to talk about fear and hate, which are exploited extensively by propagandists. In class 6, we'll look at defense mechanisms. These are things that everyone has. It's part of our psyche, and it's there to protect us when we're confronted with some situation that causes high anxiety, to try to protect us from the horrible feelings that come with that. And then we're going to look at COVID and related examples of, here is this disease, how was it exploited for propaganda purposes, and what are some of the ramifications of that disease that we might want to consider in the future in terms of post-COVID stress disorder and the trauma that's associated with that. And we've left class 8 open for purely discussion. Certainly some of the things we have programmed into the classes may spill over and we might need extra time there, but the plan was to kind of have a class solely for discussion. As you know, the span of my classes have been about looking at historical research that becomes that supports my narrative. What is my understanding of American history? And it's important to recognize that the narrative that's in my head really equates to the bias that's in my head and the worldview of how I see the world, that narrative represents basic assumptions and tenets of society that establishes a foundation for how I view the world and the events unfolding before me. This, however, also establishes a bias for accepting or rejecting information that confirms or conflicts with my narrative. So what it means is that I am susceptible to manipulation because I have this what's now established in my mind of the narrative of the world. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that I have to be closed-minded. I can listen to other information and alter that view based on new information that comes before me. But what is existing is something that if someone wants to manipulate me and they understand that, they can then structure a message to manipulate. So carefully crafted messages confirming my narrative, exploiting my confirmation bias, may compel me into supporting ideas that are contradictory to what are my views and what are my beliefs. So that's the essence of this, is to understand that we all have a sense of what is right and wrong in the world. And if I'm a propagandist, I want to understand that. I don't necessarily want to change it. I want to take what is my agenda and meld it to fit your narrative so I can manipulate you. And those messages are what we call propaganda. I'd like to relate to the propaganda industry as the public relations, marketing, advertising, industrial complex. Many of us have heard about the military industrial complex. It's important to think about the public relations industrial complex. And it begins with Freud and the ideas that he developed around the turn of the 20th century. And we want to take a look at that. Let me come to that and share. And so I want to introduce you to Freud and also to his nephew, Bernays.
Was put forward by Sigmund Freud. He had discovered, he said, primitive sexual and aggressive forces hidden deep inside the minds of all human beings. Forces which, if not controlled, led individuals and societies to chaos and destruction. This series is about how those in power have used Freud's theories to try and control the dangerous crowd in an age of mass democracy. At the heart of the story is not just Sigmund Freud, but other members of the Freud family. This episode is about Freud's American nephew, Edward Bernays. Bernays is almost completely unknown today, but his influence on the 20th century was nearly as great as his uncle's. Because Bernays was the first person to take Freud's ideas about human beings and use them to manipulate the masses. He showed American corporations for the first time how they could make people want things they didn't need by linking mass-produced goods to their unconscious desires. Out of this would come a new political idea of how to control the masses. By satisfying people's inner selfish desires, one made them happy and thus docile. It was the start of the all-consuming self, which has come to dominate our world today.
The program, The Century of Self, is available on YouTube, and it is a, I stopped that share, and you can, that again. So you can get that on YouTube, and you can watch the whole thing. It's 4 hours in total. But it is it's a very important, let me see what's happening here. Lauren, do we have America Is Here up?
Yes, we do.
Okay. And so it's an important documentary because it highlights a lot of what has gone on politically, socially, culturally in America and really around the world as we have embraced concepts of mass marketing and that sort of thing. And so if you get a chance, you may want to watch that. I have a link in the PowerPoint that I'll send out to you if you wish to receive that. Now I want to pick up another segment of this and how it was Edward Bernays who came up with the concept of public relations as a spin from the word propaganda.
As a part of the war effort, the US government set up a Committee on Public Information, and Bernays was employed to promote America's war aims in the press. The President, Woodrow Wilson, had announced that the United States would fight not to restore the old empires, but to bring democracy to all of Europe. And Bernays proved extremely skillful in promoting this idea both at home and abroad. And at the end of the war, he was asked to accompany the President to the Paris Peace Conference.
Then, to my surprise, they asked me to go over with Woodrow Wilson to the peace conference. And at the age of 26, I was in Paris for the entire time of the peace conference that was held in the suburb of Paris, and we worked to make the world safe for democracy. That was a big slogan.
Wilson's reception in Paris astounded Bernays and the other American propagandists. Their propaganda had portrayed Wilson as a liberator of the people, a man who would create a new world in which the individual would be free. They had made him a hero of the masses. And as he watched the crowds surge around Wilson, Bernays began to wonder whether it would be possible to do the same type of mass persuasion, but in peacetime.
When I came back to the United States, I decided that if you could use propaganda for war, you could certainly use it for peace. And propaganda got to be a bad word because of the Germans using it. So what I did was to try to find some other words. So we found the word Council on Public Relations.
Bernays returned to New York and set up as a public relations counsel in a small office off Broadway. It was the first time the term had ever been used. Since the end of the 19th century, America had become a mass industrial society, with millions clustered together in the cities. Bernays was determined to find a way to manage and alter the way these new crowds thought and felt. To do this, he turned to the writings of his uncle Sigmund. While in Paris, Bernays had sent his uncle a gift of some Havana cigars. In return, Freud had sent him a copy of his general introduction to psychoanalysis. Bernays read it, and the picture of hidden irrational forces inside human beings fascinated him. He wondered whether he might make money by manipulating the unconscious.
What Eddie got from Freud was indeed this idea that there is a lot more going on in human decision-making, not only among individuals, but even more importantly among groups, than this idea that information drives behavior. And so Eddie began to formulate this idea that you had to look at things that would play to people's irrational emotions. And you see, that moved Eddie immediately into a different category from other people in his field and most government officials and managers of the day who thought if you just hit people with all this factual information, they would look at that and say, oh, of course. And Eddie knew that was not the way the world worked.
Bernays.
So when we think about people are spotlight, okay. And so he realizes logic isn't necessarily the heart of what people are thinking about. And let me get, okay. And let's take, here we are, share that.
Seen by others.
Eddie Bernays saw the way to sell product was not to sell it to your intellect, that you ought to buy an automobile, but that you will feel better about it if you have this automobile. I think he originated that idea, that they weren't just purchasing something, but they were engaging themselves emotionally or personally in the product or service. That it's not, you think you need a new piece of clothing, but you'll feel better with the piece of clothing. That was his contribution in a very real sense. We see it all over the place today, but I think he originated the idea of the emotional connect to a product or service.
Okay, and there I am with that one. And with that, Terry, you're on.
Okay. Hello, everyone. It's nice to be with some of you whom I've been with before and the new people as well. I want you to imagine the following scenario. You just had a minor surgical procedure. By the way, the joke is a minor surgery is surgery on somebody else. But you just had a minor surgical procedure. You're in the recovery room. It's day op, so you're going to be going home. And you turn to the nurse and you say, when will the doctor come in? I'd like to know his findings from what I just had. And the nurse turns to you and says, the doctor was in, and you had a very lengthy conversation with him. Don't you remember? And you really don't remember. But your first inclination is to be really afraid. What in the world did I say? What did I do? I had no control over my actions, my thoughts, what came out of my mouth. I don't remember anything. Very frightening. Another scenario. You're the wife, and your husband comes home and says, I have a very important interview tomorrow. It's an interview for a job that would be a promotion and would mean a lot more money for the household. And you want that. You want it just as desperately as he does because it's your household too. And he said, but the thing that you must do, I only have the one good suit. You must take to the cleaner, and remember, get it out of the cleaners before 6 o'clock because that's when the cleaner closes. And you say, absolutely, and you fully intend to do that. You are so invested in your husband getting the promotion. Husband comes home, 8 o'clock at night, says, "Where's my suit?" And you go, "Oh my God, I forgot. I can't believe I forgot. I forgot to get your suit." And that can happen. How can it happen? Because what Freud told us, which was really scary, is you have an unconscious. You have something that you really almost have no control over. And you see, with the wife, she really resented her husband a lot. They were bickering a lot. She was annoyed with him. She was angry with him, but she truly wanted to get that suit, but she forgot. Scary, very scary. And that's what Freud introduced to the Victorian era, the prim and proper people that were part of that population during the Victorian times. He said, guess what, folks? You're not in control of yourself. And I'm going to tell you all about the psyche, the mind, the soul, whatever you want to call it, the sense of you, the essence of you. And you are not as in control of it as you think you are. Very, very frightening. Up until Freud, mental issues were really thought of in terms of biology or neurology. And asylums seconded that by very often having bacterial infections that would run rampant in an asylum of people with mental illness because of the close proximity to one another and other conditions as well. So it really did seem as though if you're mentally ill, it's a physical sickness. And by the way, Freud said that someday in the future, and that someday hasn't come yet, but someday in the future, all mental illness will be a physical illness. It'll be the neck and above, there's something wrong, and we have medication or therapy or brain something that we can offer you to ameliorate what is going on. But for now, up until Freud, it was all biology and neurology. And Freud came along and said, I'm going to talk to you about the unconscious. And the unconscious is a huge part of your mind, your psyche, whatever you want to call it. It's the iceberg. We know when we see an iceberg that what is under the surface is so much larger than what is above the surface. And that exists in our mind. And Freud said, I'm going to even dissect the psyche for you. I'm going to tell you what's in your mind. And by the way, as we just learned from this short clip on Bernays, that's what the propagandists use to get us to buy their product, to vote for their person, to think the way they do. Let me rephrase that last sentence. Let me put it this way. This is what public relations experts do to help us to understand what we may desire more than we think we do. Isn't it interesting how just one change of the word, because propaganda is so pejorative a term, and when we changed it, as Bernays explained to us to do, told us to do, public relations is so much more palatable. And isn't it sad that part of the clip, I couldn't help but think that what they were talking about all those years ago is going on now in Eastern Europe, the threat to democracy. And we also hear from the newscasters when they talk about what Russia says is going on, they refer to it as the Russian propaganda. Because again, propaganda does have that negative, does have that pejorative term. So poof goes away with just changing the word to public relations. So what did Freud tell us about the psyche? Well, Freud said there are three components: the id, the ego, and the superego. And the id is seen very, very demonstrably in an infant. They want what they want when they want it, and if they don't get it, they cry. Wah! It's all id, based on the pleasure principle. And sometimes wouldn't you like to just be all id, but you know that society won't permit you to be because you've learned that. And you've learned that, and that's part of your superego. But we skipped over the reality, principle-oriented part of the psyche, and that's the ego. And we use that term so often, don't we? My ego can't stand it. My ego can't take it. The ego mediates between the id, which is give it to me now, I want it, I want it, I want it. And the superego, that's kind of like our conscience, kind of what we have learned from our parents, learned from society, learned from the customs and mores that are part of our culture. So the ego is like the cop between the id and the superego. An example would be you're on a diet and you want to lose weight, and you see a banana split in front of you. We all know what a banana split is, but I don't even know if that term is used anymore. And all you want to do is eat it, eat it, eat it, consume it right away. Oh, I can't wait to get into it. The superego says, hold on, you're on a diet. This is going to really screw up the diet. You can't do that. And what the ego may wind up doing is having you have somebody else with this banana split, and you share it just a little bit with that person. Obviously, someone, hopefully, that you are very related to, because to share food with a stranger would be rather weird. And the ego, by the way, wouldn't let you do it anyway. So the ego is the cop between the id and the superego. So Bernays told us, because it's Freud who told us, and these principles of basic psychology, that's the foundation on which political psychologists, and there is such a thing as a political psychologist, a social psychologist builds on. And they take these Freudian concepts and they run with it and try to manipulate us via this. And next week's class will be about how they come to find out what certain subsets of the population, what certain groups of the population really desire. You know, the difference between want and need. As Bernays said, we'll make a want into a need, and we'll go there on the road to your unconscious. So Freud said, if you're ruled by your unconscious, what can we do about it? You mean I do things that I don't want to do and I have no control over it? What in the world is in my unconscious? Well, the very definition of the word unconscious lets us know that it's really not something that we are aware of. Now, every once in a while, you'll look at something and you'll say, ooh, I'd really like that. I don't know why, but I get a good feeling when I see that. And then it comes to you, oh, I remember when I was young, I was walking the boardwalk of Atlantic City and I saw taffy and candy, that color, and it was a good time in my life. That's called the preconscious. That's that part of the unconscious that is easily retrievable. So that's not a problem for us, because if it's easily retrievable and we find ourselves in a situation, we can retrieve it. But the bulk of the unconscious is unconscious. So Freud said there's a couple of ways of getting at it, but you've got to get at it through therapy. And the royal road to the unconscious, dreams. The interpretation of dreams, having two elements in it, the manifest element, what you dreamt of literally, and the latent content, what that means. Freudian slips can sometimes get us to have a little bit of a look into what's in our unconscious. So it's free association. You ever have a word and then all of a sudden it just something else pops into your head? Well, that could be, again, that unconscious relationship between one word and an experience or a feeling or something else. So those are, in a nutshell, without going into psychosexual stages of development, like if you're messy, you're fixated at the anal stage, and if you smoke too much or you chew gum or you bite your fingers, you're fixated at the oral stage, because Freud told us all about that too, the psychosexual stages of development. And he also told us that the first 5 years, that's it. The first 5 years go awry, you are screwed. If I were lecturing in New York, I would use a different term and it would be acceptable. I understand that I cannot. I just use that term when I speak privately to Sal. But anyway, unacceptable. So we're left with what's a person to do? Is a person really going to go through psychoanalytic therapy that takes years, that takes a lot of money, that takes up a considerable amount of your time? Well, in this day and age, we kind of are saying, not really. There are still many neo-Freudians out there, people that ascribe to Freud's theories, but they changed it somewhat. You know, we know about Jung, and Jung saying this psychosexual stuff, too much. Freud just got on the wrong topic and wore blinders to other things, or Adler with social interaction is important, or Karen Horney that laughed at penis envy when it came to women, no such thing. So many therapists have not disregarded Freud, but built upon Freud or changed Freud ever so slightly to fit the modern age of how can we help people with problems. And what is the most popular thing today is cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. And one form of it is rational emotive behavior therapy, which, as I just said, is a type of CBT, cognitive behavior or behavioral therapy. Some people call it behavior therapy, some people call it behavioral therapy. Potato, doesn't matter. But that's really what we use today. And what are some of the principles? And again, remember, what we're discussing now is the education of the political psychologists, the education of people who are going to be interacting with us to get us to believe as they believe, or to vote for their candidate, or to buy their product over another product, or to use their service. So cognitive behavior therapy, rational emotive behavior therapy, founded by Albert Ellis, and I was privileged to have met him, says to us, we think, we feel, and we behave all at the same time. You can't separate it. It all happens at once. And if something happens to you, which is an event, let's say you're a teenage girl and your boyfriend just broke up with you, and you are feeling so depressed, so upset, the world is over in your head. And if someone were to ask said teenager, why are you so sad and depressed? She would say, because my boyfriend just dumped me. And the reality is, that's not why she's depressed. Or another example, you flunked a test, flunked a math test, or you flunked the bar for to be a lawyer, or anything. You flunked a test for a promotion. And you're feeling very, very miserable as a result of it. And again, if someone were to say to you, why are you so upset? Why are you so miserable? What's going on with you? You say, oh, I flunked the test. And it's not because you flunked the test. So what is it from? It's what you tell yourself it means that you flunked the test. It's what you tell yourself it means that your boyfriend dumped you. It's what you believe. Your belief is what's causing the emotional consequence. That is what's causing the upsettedness to you. And the way into that is to examine that belief, to challenge that belief, and have a different default button in your head about that belief. And that's where we are today. And kind of that's, in a nutshell, what the political psychologists, what the professional public relations people are using in order to get us to look at their candidate and vote for that candidate, or not believe this one, or buy that car, the red sports car. We know what that symbolizes. And by the way, one of most favorite lines I have with Freud is, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Because some of us get a little too crazy with, oh, he just bought a red sports car, he's going to leave his wife. Or he bought a red sports car, he's got to be feeling insecure in the sack. Who knows what we tell ourselves? But in any event, sometimes simply a cigar is a cigar. But to the political psychologists who are going to use these basic concepts of psychology, it's gold. It's their Rosetta Stone. It's their entree into our psyche to get us to believe it's really our idea, just really me. And when I was reading up a little bit about this, I was very surprised to read that subliminal advertising is not illegal. I thought it was. The old, you're watching a movie and there's like split second of a picture of popcorn, and you feel that you want to have popcorn, and you go out and you buy the popcorn at the movie theater, and you have no idea that what just happened to you was, it was just a second, but now it's in your psyche. Or people that put on headphones to learn something while they sleep. It's your psyche, and there are people that want to read it and want to read it better than we do for ourselves. If there are any questions or any thoughts, Sal will come on and do what Sal does best. Before he does that, thank you, Sal. Some of the irrational beliefs that we harbor in us cause us to be quite kind of crazy. And before we go into some of those irrational beliefs, let's talk about the big one. Life should be fair. First of all, there is a statement in rational emotive behavior therapy that says, I will not should on myself today. Because when we should on ourselves and we violate a should, we don't feel quite so good. But there are political propagandists out there that are going to make us think something is a should. But the reality is, other than murder and other heinous behaviors, very little in life is a should. Should you love your parents? Not really. It's not a should. One hopes that you do, and one hopes that you had a comfortable childhood, which allows you to love your parents, but we know that some people do not. It's not a should. And one of the biggest beliefs that we all hold so dear and make us so crazy is life should be fair. And we see all the time that it isn't. We're watching it unfold nightly on the news. It's so unfair to the Ukraine, what one man is doing to it. And it makes us just so crazy. And that's what we say to ourselves. It makes me crazy. And I'm here to tell you it doesn't. We make ourselves crazy when we see something because we tell ourselves what it means. when we see something, and we can untell ourselves what it means so that we don't have to act so irrationally. But the propagandists that are out there want you to crave that red sports car. It's just got to be a Corvette. I remember when the Thunderbird came out, and it was kind of like the 57 Thunderbird. And in 57, everybody wanted to have a Thunderbird, and they wanted it to be a red Thunderbird. It meant you were cool. It meant you had money. It meant all kinds of things. So they're out there trying to tell us, you should. Let's change that want into a need, because if you need it, and that's what your gut says, I need it, you're going to get it. Big irrational belief, as I just said, life should be fair. Sometimes good things happen to bad people. Maybe they get punished, rewarded, whatever, in a life that we know nothing of on planet Earth. But yes, sometimes bad things happen to good people, and sometimes good things happen to bad people. We walk around being people pleasers. We're not going to go step by step, but you've got the PowerPoint that lists a lot of the basic irrational beliefs. We're people pleasers, and it gets us into a lot of trouble. Because if we feel we have to be loved and liked by everybody, then we're going to do whatever they ask us to do. And that's why a lot of kids get into a lot of trouble, because they want to be liked by their peers. And when you know that the brain is not fully developed until the age of 25, that's why a lot of kids do a lot of really stupid things that ruin themselves for the rest of their life, because they believe irrationally that this is what has to happen. Or we have black and white thinking. Everything is either good or everything is either bad. No, there's areas of gray. So there's all kinds of very popular irrational beliefs that the propagandists out there will play upon to get us to vote their way. So I think my time is up, and I return you to Uncle Sal.
Okay, well, I want to thank you, Terry. I want to make sure that we stay on time. We can stop for questions and discussion now, or I have another video for the remaining time. Lauren, do we want to see if anyone wants to just talk now, or?
Well, we don't have any hands raised yet.
Okay.
So.
Well, then I'm going to go ahead and
go ahead and do your video, and then I have a question for Dr. Bordan.
Okay. All right. Well, I want you to see that we went through a period where people were active out on the streets in the 1960s, protesting war, protesting civil rights, all of that. And then there was a massive change come the 1970s. We went from looking at the bulk of the population to turning inward, and it becoming what became known as the century of the self. And who picked up on it the quickest? The public relations industrial complex.
In 1970, it was a small percentage of the total population, maybe 3 to 5%. By 1980, it had spread to the vast majority of the public, up to 80%.
You asked the question, how do you get self-actualized? You take this day and you say, when I shave every morning, I look in that mirror, I say to myself, I really say this, I say, nobody is going to ruin this day for you, Wayne Dyer, nobody.
That this preoccupation with the self and the inner self traveled and spread throughout the society in the 1970s.
It helped me to stop living in the past and start building from today and using my experiences in a positive way to be a better person today and tomorrow.
But then the problem comes, well, how do you be self-expressive?
And it was at this point that American capitalism decided it was going to step in and help these new individuals to express themselves, and in the process make a lot of money. The first thing they were going to do was to find a way of getting inside their heads, to discover what these new beings wanted in order to be themselves. This came not from Madison Avenue, but from one of the most powerful scientific research institutes in America. Stanford Research Institute in California worked for corporations and government. It had done much of the early work on computers, and was also working for the Department of Defense on what would become the Star Wars project. In 1978, a group of economists and psychologists at SRI decided to find a way to read, measure, and fulfill the desires of these new unpredictable consumers.
The idea was to create a rigorous tool for measuring a whole range of desires, wishes, values that prior to that time had been kind of overlooked. They say in business, what gets measured gets done. We were basically telling manufacturers, if you're really going to satisfy not just the basic needs, but individuated wants, whims, and desires of more highly developed human beings, you're going to have to segment. You're going to have to individuate.
To do this, SRI turned for help to those who had begun the liberation of the self. In particular, one of the leaders of the human potential movement, a psychologist called Abraham Maslow. Through observing the work at places like Esalen, Maslow had invented a new system of psychological types. He called it the hierarchy of needs, and it described the different emotional stages that people went through as they liberated their feelings. At the top was self-actualization. This was the point at which individuals became completely self-directed and free of society. The team at SRI thought that Maslow's hierarchy might form the basis for a new way to categorize society, not by social class, but by different psychological desires and drives. To test this, they designed a huge questionnaire with hundreds of questions about how people saw themselves, their inner values. The questions were designed to see whether people fitted into Maslow's categories.
We were trying to find out what people really felt like. So we asked these really penetrating questions, and we hired a company that administers surveys, to do them. They said they've never seen anything like it. Usually you have to send out a postcard 6 weeks and then another postcard, and then you got to call the people up, to get the return rates up. We had an 86% return, and they only sent out one postcard. People loved filling out this questionnaire. We got several questionnaires back with a note attached saying, do you have any other questionnaires I could fill out? Because we were asking people to think about things that they had never thought about before, and they liked thinking about them.
Like what? Like what they felt inside?
Yeah, like what they felt inside. What motivated them? What was their life about? What was important to them? It was sort of like, wow.
The answers were then analyzed by computer. It revealed that there were underlying patterns in the way people felt about themselves, which fitted Maslow's categories. And at the top of the hierarchy were a large and growing group which cut across all social classes. The SRI team called them the inner directives. These were people who felt they were not defined by their place in society, but by the choices they made themselves. But what SRI discovered was that these people could be defined by the different patterns of behavior through which they chose to express themselves. Self-expression was not infinite. It fell into identifiable types. And the SRI team invented a new term for it: lifestyles. They had managed to categorize the new individualism. They called their system Values and Lifestyles, VALS for short.
At the forefront of this change are 3 new VALS groups we call inner directive. These are people for whom personal satisfaction is more important than status or money. They tend to be self-expressive, complex, and individualistic. Rob is an I am me. I am me's are searching for new values, breaking away from traditions and inventing their own standards. Rob even invented his own name, Rob Noxious. Jody is an experiential. This is a group seeking inner growth through direct experience. Experientials aren't in one place much. This is the try anything once crowd, and all that activity takes goods and services. Their hobbies are hands-on, and their possessions are simple, but not always simply priced.
I'm a bookseller. I sell books. I'm a businessman. That doesn't necessarily mean that I believe in capitalism. It just happens to be what I'm doing now.
What we have is people are going to be individualistic, and the public relations industrial complex is going to take all these individuals and put them together in a group. And they will all go marching together to the drum beat of the public relations industrial complex. But we'll talk more about that in the coming weeks. Okay, with that, Lauren, I think we can open up for discussion. We have one hand raised, and we'll go from there.
Well, Lauren had a question.
Well, let's see. Go ahead, Margita. I believe you're.
Yes.
There we go.
Yes.
Hi.
Can you hear me? Hi.
Yes. Good to see you.
Dr. Borden, I have a question for you. As you were explaining to us, it's not a theory, I guess, the fact that people's own interpretation of an event causes their feeling as to whether this is very negative or to them, which then causes a depression or sadness, etc. So my question is, where does that personal interpretation come from? I mean, I would think there's a whole complex whatever underneath that leads us to interpret that event in a horrible way. Is that totally in the unconscious and will take, forever to figure out and just jump over that with more rational reactions? Or what are we doing about that huge iceberg underneath that makes us jump to that interpretation?
It's a very good question. And everybody, please call me Terry. The only person who calls me Dr. Borden is Sal. And then I either call him Uncle Sal or Dr. Sal. Yes. Where does that belief come from? The belief comes from society, from your parents, from your experience, from what you've read, for what's going on. It's all kinds of things. We have a lot of tapes that play in our head all the time. And depending upon the orientation of the therapist, it can be attacked different ways. Someone who is a classical psychoanalyst would want to get into your childhood, your experiences when you were growing up, what happened to you, how your parents were, how you interacted with your siblings, you name it. The behaviorists say, cut it out. As a matter of fact, Ellis used to be a psychoanalyst, but he realized that everything that was Freudian, he called horse blank. And he would say it in his nasal way. He talked like very nasal. Freudian psychoanalysis is all horse blank. He said, change your way of thinking, and we'll change your way of thinking by disputing your unreasonable. I never called to my clients irrational thoughts. I always called them unreasonable thoughts. We will attack those unreasonable thoughts. I used to say to clients, I'm the jury, and I'm a jury of one. Convince me that your boyfriend dumped you and you're never going to have another love in your life again. Convince me. Or convince me that you flunked the math test and now you're not going to get into any college and your life is ruined. Convince me so I can vote your way. So we challenge, we dispute, and then we experience. So very different ways of approaching it. And sometimes the unconscious comes up, sometimes it doesn't come up. And again, depending upon your orientation, doesn't matter. It will show itself in your behaviors, in your beliefs, in your life experiences, in your values. So yeah, you don't have to be on some shrink's couch for the rest of your life going there 3 times a week to get at the thoughts of what you don't know about.
Yeah, I would think that the unconscious is something that what's stored in there is really something you probably never get rid of.
No,
it's almost like the reptilian part of our brains, not that it's the unconscious. It's just there because of mechanisms of how we experience the world. But we have to jump over that somehow through our prefrontal cortex, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're just in our infancy. We're not even in the infancy of understanding the brain. We now are starting to investigate that if you have a very traumatic life experience, it somehow gets imprinted in your brain, but kind of like in your DNA, and it can affect future generations of you. And it was based on your experience. So we're just now getting into those kinds of examinations and research. The brain is probably our best and biggest and most brilliant tool, and we don't know how to use it yet. Was that helpful?
Yes, thank you so much.
So my question, before I'm going to jump ahead of anybody else that's coming on, is we've seen propaganda, or whatever you want to call it, for our political parties, and we noticed that that messaging is received very differently by different people. And the messaging can be received very differently within even the same family, like kids and their parents or siblings. And we've seen over the last several years that this has caused not only a political divide in our country, but in many cases, families and friends and whatever are also divided because they're receiving these messages and reacting to them so differently. So I guess my question is really like, how can people that are so closely related receive those messages so differently from each other? Does that make sense?
Oh, sure. Sal, you want to talk about bias?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, it's also, I mean, that when you look at what they were saying about how they were subdividing the people, you had your experiential people, you had your, social conscious people. They were dividing them up, not based on families, but based on these particular characteristics, what their predisposition, what their worldview was. So what their narrative is. So within a family, you're going to have one narrative. There'll be the child who may have a very different one. And what the public relations people are doing are placing them into different categories and then appealing to it. And so you're going to have that disparity right there within the same group of people watching the same message. And
So-
that is what they've done, I think, very effectively.
Let's also throw in, are you done? I didn't mean to interrupt you. Sal, did you have anything
Well, I
else?
was just going to, as a follow-up, ask, is that like a really innate thing, like right-handed and left-handed people? Or is that more of a learned response?
Nature versus nurture has been the age-old question about everything. I like to think of it in terms of challenging your cognitions, because the intra-family dispute that turns into a fight is because of the beliefs in somebody's head. So if you have a belief that if you're a Trumper, you are stupid and crazy and selfish and money-oriented, which stereotyping, I'm not saying that that is my thought or Sal's at all. You're going to feel a certain way when you argue with somebody who is in a different political theme than you. So you have to challenge that. I live in Colorado now. That's why I can only do Zoom classes, because the commute would be a killer. But I have one friend here. I'm an isolate. That's for another class. She has a totally different political view from me. And her friend that visits along with her is a member of an organization that really, in my head, has some negative consequences. And we get along well because I challenge that belief. She's not a bad person. I'm not a bad person. She just thinks differently from me, but it doesn't make her all bad or me all good, or vice versa. So cognitions also is a very important piece of how you can have intra-family differences and conflicts, and what is innate and what is learned. You know, there are a lot of people that say, hey, nurture is so important, and we see that it is, but we also have had studies where identical twins are separated, and then we say, hey, it's nurture.
Len, what do you have there?
Yes, I wonder if the issue between, let's say, cognitive behavior therapy and, say, psychopharmacology have drugs supplanted the attempt to correct problematic situations people have. Give them a drug and you don't really know what the problem is, but it's cured. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Absolutely, absolutely. And we're embarking on a whole new era of neuroscience, and there's things that are going to be happening that are really unimaginable today. But absolutely, even Freud said it. Freud said all the stuff's going to be cured someday by pills. So even the master of psychoanalysis said it's just going to be, you have a condition from the neck up, no different than having a condition from the neck down. And I'm glad you said the word psychopharmacology, because this is very important. If you are feeling depressed, if you are feeling anxious, if you have a mental health issue, go to, have your therapy, go to somebody that, because the best is talk of, along with pharmacological intervention, the $50 word for pills, drugs. But sometimes, especially as we get older, we take so much medication that you want to go to a real specialist, and that's a psychopharmacologist. That's a psychiatrist who really understands the synergistic effect of pills and can be able to advise you properly as to dosing and when to take it, et cetera, and what to take. So sometimes our primaries are very excellent, but that's not their specialty. And if you're not a garden variety, depressed kind of person without any, there are people that are on one pill a day. I'm on so many pills that I'm always afraid I'll get arrested as a drug dealer. So the reality is you want to go to a specialist. But yes, combination. The best is talk and drugs, depending upon the situation. Very often, you don't need drugs, fine, but we also have to change our beliefs especially in the older population, as to what we tell ourselves it means that you have to take a psychotropic, big word for mood-altering drug doesn't make you crazy. I'm here to tell you that I'm on an antidepressant, and I'm not ashamed to be on one. My husband died about a year ago, and I need that. And I need that more than I need to talk to a therapist. And I'm on it. And no big deal.
Thank you.
If I can just add a quick point, and is that the drugs treat what has manifested as your condition, but it doesn't get to the root cause. Psychological counseling is more aimed at getting to the root cause. And I think it's important to make that distinction.
Joy?
Yeah, I have heard that, and maybe it's the insurance companies that are responsible, but that CBT can work in as little as 10 sessions. I think that's the max in some insurance. Is that real, or is that artificial because of insurance?
Insurance. The same way they had a rule that you had to fail 3 times in a outpatient substance abuse facility before the insurance company would even think about permitting you to be inpatient someplace. Insurance, that you're not allowed to go someplace to detox. Insurance, usually decided by somebody that has no mental health background, decides, oh, you have this code, so yes, that's 6 sessions. It's insurance, and it's a travesty.
Thank you. I assume that it's individual as to how many sessions you need.
Sometimes it isn't, depending upon your health insurance. That's why people are always arguing for parity, for mental health issues to be considered as important as physical health issues, and they certainly are.
Thank you.
We're over time now, and just next week we're going to pick up this topic again. I would like for you to think about, on the individual level, we have the psychologist and counseling that is dealing with an individual, and I'd like you to then look at it as the propagandist is looking at the broad population, dissecting it into individual groups and structuring messages based on what would happen with an individual, but then is projecting that onto the mass audience. So, which becomes really the mechanism for propaganda. Yeah.
Sal, would you do me a favor, and when you send out whatever you're going to be sending out to the attendees, would you include my email address and even my phone number? And I taught graduate school, so the students would call me at home, so I'm very used to it. That's in case anybody has a question that they thought of after the class, or perhaps has a question that they didn't want to ask publicly. Please feel free to get in touch with me.
Great.
And before
Okay,
we
everyone.
go here, I just want to let everyone take a chance to thank Sal and Terry for a great start to a new session. We really appreciate you dialing in from Colorado.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Again,
Hey, what you got to say, Sal? What are you going to say?
Say good night, Gracie.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone.
And for everyone who wants to receive